First of all, take a look at the area I'm focusing on. This is the area I'm focusing on. As you see here, the lines. Can you see this properly? Is it properly displayed? Yes. Okay. So the area I'm focusing on is between the Gustav and the Gothic line, but actually it's north of the Gustav line. It's the area just north of Rome and south of the line which connects roughly Pisa and Rimini. That's what the Allies identified as central Italy, as we shall see in a moment. Now, this was, of course, German-controlled territory in those months, and it was also of vital importance, since the German army needed to make sure it could supply its troops on the front line, both containing the Anzio-Nettuno beachhead and also containing the Allies along the Gustav line. On the other side, the Allies concentrated their efforts in breaking, or at least damaging, German lines of communication, and they used different strategies. At the same time, Central Italy saw the emergence of the movement which is known as the Italian resistance. This movement, for many actors, including the partisans themselves, remained for some months an unknown quantity. The Allies in particular, both the special services and the military commanders, remained skeptical of its military worth. The first bands, formed in the days after the armistice, were mainly composed of junior officers and soldiers unwilling to surrender to the Germans, as most of their commanders had done, under the feeble and largely passive direction of Italy's government now in Brindisi. These military men had little experience of guerrilla fighting. They had few resources and inadequate weapons. Moreover, there was, at least during the first few weeks after the armistice, the feeling that the Allies would liberate Central Italy very soon, making fighting unnecessary. The events on the ground soon shattered these illusions, and the resistance began to take shape, conducting its first actions in the form of sabotage and isolated attacks against fascists and Germans. Eventually, a number of bands were formed, some with a more military structure, under the influence and control of the military officers in Rome, particularly under Colonel Montezemolo and his FMC, Fronte Militare Clandestino, and other bands were more political, and they responded to the CLN, Comitati di Liberazione Nazionale, which had sprung up in many towns and referred loosely to the central CLN then in Rome. I will not attempt here even to summarize the history of the partisan movement, given its complexity and its extension. Here, the tables I will present try to give some evidence. Here, circled in red are the mountainous areas of this region where the partisans were able to organize themselves and gradually become a fighting force. Table 1.3 makes the same point, showing how the bands were scattered across the territory and identifying some of the groups to which they belonged. In particular, the map shows the military formations: the Raggruppamento Montesorate, north of Rome, the Raggruppamento Castelli Romani, south of the capital, the Raggruppamento Gran Sasso across the Abruzzi and the Marche, the Amiata formation in Tuscany, and also Umbria had a number of partisan formations. The picture is far from complete. This table is taken from Allied documents and illustrates what the Allies knew about the bands operating south and astride the line Terni-Rieti-Viterbo. The number of these formations, as you see, is indeed very considerably high, and shows how incomplete was their process of unification and consolidation. Despite all this, the partisans eventually established themselves as a fighting force, and they constituted a problem for the fascists and the Germans, and perhaps an opportunity for the Allies. If we go back to table 1-2, andiamo indietro di due. Ecco. In black, we see the main headquarters of the German Militärkommandaturen, based primarily in Perugia, Macerata, Viterbo, L'Aquila, and spreading out to other provincial capitals. German military government was superimposed on the government of Mussolini's Repubblica Sociale Italiana, to which the Germans left ordinary administrative matters. Since the opponents of the fascists fled the towns for the hills and mountains, fascist authorities were able to establish themselves quite easily in the towns, and in fact, in some centers they enjoyed a certain amount of consensus. For example, Perugia, Rieti, Viterbo were known for a variety of reasons as fascist-inclined towns. More difficult was it for the fascists to hold on to the small centers, villages and mountainous areas where they had always enjoyed indifferent support. More difficult still was their situation when they tried to enforce the enrollment of young men belonging to the classes of 1924 and 1925, many of which joined the partisan bands rather than fighting for the fascists and Nazis. In the first few months, the Germans did not show their most aggressive face. Their main objective was to defend the supply route from the north down to Rome and to the battlefields. It should be added that their commander-in-chief, Albert Kesselring, set up his military headquarters near Mount Sorate, north of Rome, from where he could dominate the main traffic routes towards the capital. Only exceptionally did the German army conduct incursions in the mountains. Things changed rapidly, however, during the first few months of 1944. Partisan activity increased, the creation of the Anzio beachhead galvanized the resistance, often leading bands to expose themselves unnecessarily. The fascist authorities began to lose their grip. Since the ordinary German contingents in the rear of the armies were of second quality, special counterinsurgency units were brought in for the purpose, mainly under the direction of the SS. General Karl Wolff, the SS commander, gradually became the key figure in the military occupation. Massive German roundups brought havoc mainly to the civilian population, since the partisans were often able to disengage and escape. It also must be stressed that the German army was preparing to retreat northwards to make a stand on the Gothic line, and needed to make sure that its passage was clear. By their raids, the Germans sought to achieve two further objectives: to round up and deport as many men as possible to work in Germany for the TOT organization, and to impair and damage the functioning of the Italian economy once it returned to the Allies. In this respect, they had made their choice early on in their occupation. They would try to concentrate all the machinery, installations, and raw materials in northern Italy, carrying away what they could and destroying the rest. Especially in the Terni area, there were many important war factories, the best known being the Terni steelworks. Many of these were dismantled and shipped northwards. Others were blown up before the Allies arrived. The Germans therefore made only a perfunctory use of the Italian war machine in central Italy, showing that they considered their stay to be but temporary. Airfields and ports, however, they used intensively, always, however, as intermediate stations to facilitate transfers of battle wear from the north towards the front line. And then I come to my second point. My second point is Allied missions behind the lines. Central Italy, particularly the area stretching between Umbria and the Marche, became a strategic area, especially after the landing at Anzio in January 1944, which placed it immediately behind the front. A military presence was crucial for the Allies to prevent enemy airstrikes on Anzio, to jeopardize supply lines, and ultimately to wear down the German army. However, as I said earlier, the Allies had little military and political information on partisan groups in central Italy. Their contacts were few and uncertain, and their intelligence agencies, especially the British SOE, which in Italy took the name of Special Force Number 1, and its US counterpart, OSS, struggled to establish their first missions in enemy-occupied territory. 2 words about Allied Special Forces. Special Force Number 1 set up its headquarters in Monopoli, not far from Foggia and Bari, in late 1943. 2 were its main objectives: airdrops to partisan bands, missions in enemy-occupied territory. However, they could count only on a limited supply of aircraft for their missions, given the competition by other agencies and operations in theaters such as Greece and the Balkans. They were able to count on a number of select personnel provided by the Italian SIM, Servizi Informazioni Militari, which was the equivalent of SOE, and it now had been reformed, given new leadership, and transferred south under Italy's new government and Allied supervision. It was able to recruit specialized personnel for the missions. Some were paratroopers and members of Special Corps, others were radio operators. During the campaign, more than 100 of these men served for Special Force Number 1, and even a greater number for the OSS operations. An important contribution came at this early stage from the British Army's Special Air Service, SAS. This unit had been created during the Western Desert Campaign by Lieutenant David Stirling, and it consisted of teams of parachute-trained soldiers operating behind enemy lines to gain intelligence as well as to carry out attack and sabotage missions. The OSS worked along similar lines to the SOE. For the purpose of this paper, it's important to remember that during the winter of 1943-44, the problems facing the Allied Secret Services were similar: few aircraft available for the missions, and thus a limited amount of airdrops to the resistance, especially to the bands in central Italy, with which, as I said, contacts were minimal. It appears that the first successful drops had to wait December 1943. However, activity increased during the spring and summer of 1944. Just a word on other intelligence organizations. Another important one, or much smaller in a way, but it's still important, was the so-called A-Force, which had the remit to liberate escaped POWs behind enemy lines and operated along the Adriatic coast and in other areas. This was a small inter-allied unit which carried out some good work, also by establishing contacts with partisan networks. POWs were a factor in all Allied considerations, given so many of them were hanging out behind enemy lines. I will now briefly focus on 3 important Allied missions which highlight their priorities and illustrate their difficulties. Table 2-1. The first one, Pomegranate mission, targeted the Sant'Egidio airport near Perugia, rightly considered an important base for the German and fascist aircraft, from where attacks were launched on the coast of Lazio. The airport was defended by impressive anti-aircraft batteries, which made attacks from the air difficult. Unfortunately, the SAS commando was not successful. A party of 6 agents was parachuted on the 13th of January 1944 near Lake Trasimene, well to the north of the airfield. The commander of the mission, Major Witherington, was killed 3 days later when setting the charges at the airport itself. The second in command, Lieutenant Hughes, was wounded and captured by the Germans. He later escaped. The other 4 members of the team lost touch and managed to make their way back to Allied lines. Very few enemy planes suffered damage. A second mission was even more ambitious and was carried out again by an SAS commando under the code name of Naples. Its aim was to blow up railway lines in central Italy namely the bridge near Orte, north of Rome, and the line between Ancona and Fabriano. The team was composed of 17 members and was parachuted in early January in the mountains near L'Aquila. They found conditions in the mountains very difficult, probably lost their way a few times, split up in a number of smaller groups, and on the way they gathered a good number of escaped POWs lingering in the mountains. They tried at different points to reach their objectives and set off their explosive charges, and it is unclear whether they managed to do some damage to the bridges northeast of Orte. What is clear is that all the agents were eventually captured and executed by the Germans. The mission reveals how much importance the Allies gave to disrupting the railway lines. Finally, a third example. The third example is not really a mission, but in many ways it can be compared to the previous ones. Many escaped prisoners came in contact with partisan bands. In some cases, they joined them. Many Slavs, for example, fought with the communist-inspired bands. English-speaking prisoners often were more reluctant, but in some cases, they also joined the partisans. This was the case with about 300 fugitive POWs, including many officers, in the North Chaviso area, controlled by a partisan band named Banda Melis. The task of bringing them together was taken on by a Dutch professor, probably a Secret Service officer called Luis Wagenaar, and by Lieutenant Sergio Forti, an Italian officer. Wagenaar was in touch with Sir Francis Darcy Osborne, UK ambassador to the Vatican, while Forti seems to have received money and weapons from the Allies and the Rome Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale. Eventually, an Italian Anglo-American partisan unit was established in the high plain of Castelluccio di Norcia with the task of sabotaging German lines of communication. It was divided into squads, some of which were put under the command of Allied officers. Lieutenant Forti, who was awarded a gold medal for military valor, was captured and killed a few days before the liberation, while carrying out a sabotage mission together with Lieutenant Thomas O'Brien of the Royal Engineers and other Allied servicemen. Table 2. Vado avanti che viene it's difficult to read, but I summarize it briefly by saying that after the liberation, the PWB, Psychological War Branch, summarized the contribution of this unit, highlighting how much interesting, important sabotage work they had managed to do on some of the key highways leading to Rome, for example, the Salaria Highway. What this shows is that a small fighting force, well organized, under joint command, Italian and Allied, could do a considerable amount of damage and serve the Allied cause. I come now to my third and final point, which is the bombing campaign. The bombing campaign. Now, the Anzio landing provided a focus for stepping up the Allied air campaign. The Allied air forces available in support of the operation numbered around 2,300 USAAF planes and 1,400 RAF planes, over half of which were based in the airfields set up near Brindisi, Termoli, and Foggia. The remaining flew from near Naples and from Corsica and Sardinia. These numbers were enough to overwhelm the German Air Force, which counted, according to my figures, around 500 planes, although some more were summoned from French airfields. The Germans, however, had an effective anti-aircraft capability, with which they inflicted heavy damage, accounting for 75% of total losses to Allied aircraft. The objective of Allied planes were A, to support the 5th and 8th Armies, B, to destroy the German Air Force, C, to interfere as much as possible with German movements in central Italy and towards Anzio. Following D-Day, objectives came, of course, to include the protection for the beachheads, preventing German movements to Anzio from northern Italy, providing support for the assault forces. German lines of communication had a high priority. They were to account for half the flights of strategic bombers and 2/3 of the effort of medium-day bombers. High priority was given to the area of central Italy, north of Rome and south of the Pisa-Rimini line. Throughout the bombing campaign, rail transport enjoyed a high priority, followed by enemy airfields and ports. The target list shown on table 3.1 identifies the main railway routes. The Rome-Florence line was marked with an A, given the highest priority. The central line, Florence, Firenze, Arezzo, Bologna, Foligno, Terni, came immediately after with a B1 priority. The West Coast, Pisa, Roma, received a C, while the smaller lines in Tuscany and between Roma and Viterbo were marked D. The East Coast had a low priority of I. Table 3.2 details target areas in the crucial 2 weeks before and after the Anzio landing. It is overwhelmingly clear that the efforts of the Allies were highly concentrated in central Italy, north of Rome. In fact, as shown in table 3.3, I'm not sure you'll be able to read it, but bombers were supposed to switch from one objective to another in pursuit of what was called interdiction, that is, causing maximum havoc over a protracted period of time and hitting a variety of targets, sections of track, bridges, viaducts, stations, repair shops, and marshalling yards, large and small. Table 3.4 illustrates other targets in central Italy, including therefore airfields, harbors, and urban centers. A few examples on the ground may serve to illustrate the point. The airport near Perugia was put out of action, at least temporarily, on the 19th of January by Allied planes belonging to the 449th Bomber Group. However, this was not the end of the story because it was hit another 13 times. And other airports hit were Ciampino, Guidonia, Pontedera in Tuscany, Viterbo, Orvieto, Foligno, Pistoia, Iesi, Rieti, as well as the bigger airfields in northeast Italy. While the Allied bombs destroyed few aircrafts, because there were few aircrafts there to destroy, they managed to put the airfields out of use, at least temporarily. Along the coast, the Allied aircraft fought a war mainly against small harbors. In fact, the Germans had long since avoided relying on large cargoes and made effective use of small craft, enabling supplies to be spread out over a number of small locations. On the Adriatic side, harbors like Giulianova and San Benedetto had the advantage of being near to the front lines and were used in preference to Ancona. The smallest of the targets required Allied aircraft to use rockets instead of torpedoes. The task was made more difficult by winter weather and anti-aircraft. So there were a number of these small harbors that the Allies tried to put out of use. As the situation in the battlefield in Anzio and Cassino stalled, air operations achieved an even greater priority, and on March 19th, Operation Strangle was launched, with the aim to destroy within 2 months German rail, road, and sea communications south of the line Pisa-Rimini, and make it impossible for the Germans to maintain their divisions in central Italy. Therefore, much more of the same interdiction strategy was carried out. All kinds of targets were hit, including electrical installations, power stations, etc. At this stage, it was observed, in particular by Allied strategist Professor Solly Zuckerman, that it would have been preferable to target a few key marshalling yards, most of which were in northern Italy, whereas targets in central Italy were so diverse, difficult to reach, given their mountainous surroundings, that they were apt to fail a cost-benefit analysis. In fact, an objective post-facto evaluation of the bombing campaign eventually was to reach the same conclusions. Whereas undoubtedly the Allied bombing campaign achieved at least part of its mission, the amount of resources employed was probably disproportionate. What is more, the interdiction strategy was bound to cause a lot of collateral damage to civilians as well as to buildings and monuments, especially in an area with so much artistic heritage. Many Italians were waiting for the Allies and were thus willing to tolerate even the Allied bombings. Even so, civilian casualties left a legacy of moral defeatism, often tinged with anguish and anger. The Germans, moreover, were able to respond effectively, and their supply lines were never totally interrupted. The Wehrmacht brought in specialized teams in rail repair, able to deal with most of the rail track and bridge destruction. In central Italy, they carried their supply shipments by rail as south as possible, and then continued their route nighttime by road. Movement of troops took place along the smaller railway lines in central Italy, reaching as far south as possible. The Italian railway system was too large and too widely spread out to be put out of action by any scale of attack that the Allied air forces, huge though they were, could mount and maintain. While the Allies believed that their effort would produce a crisis of supply for the German divisions at the front, this does not appear to have been the case. Italy's terrain favored the defenders, not just at the front, but in the rear areas as well. I come to my brief conclusions. After the liberation of Rome on June the 7th, Alexander issued specific orders for the drive to the north. The British 8th Army advanced across Umbria to the area between Florence and Bibbiena, while the American 5th Army, moving up the Tyrrhenian coast, aimed at the Pisa-Lucca-Pistoia triangle. The Arno River Valley was to become, in fact, or breaching the Gothic line. Along the Adriatic coast, the 5th Army Corps of the British 8th Army was eventually to be relieved by the Polish 2nd Corps and 3 brigades of the CIL, Italian Liberation Corps. Kesselring's objective was to slow down the Allied advance and gain time. The German retreat was therefore gradual and carefully planned, offering temporary resistance along a succession of defensive lines. On their way, German troops systematically demolished everything that could be of military value, as well as engaging in systematic theft and violence, leading to a string of civilian massacres. In the meantime, the fascist authorities had escaped northwards, while the partisans played a role in flanking the Allied advance. The Allied advance was slower than expected, and yet one by one, the towns in central Italy were liberated. Perugia was liberated on June the 20th, Siena on the 3rd of July, Arezzo on the 15th of July, Ancona on the 18th, Florence on August the 4th. The population was relieved. Political parties coalesced around the CLNs and tried to influence the decisions and the appointments made by the officers of Allied military government, and after months of death and tribulation, a new chapter was beginning. Thank you.
Professor